Story 1. The Roommate. Sophie had spent weeks searching for an apartment in the bustling city. She was eager to leave her shared dorm room behind, yearning for privacy and independence. Late one evening, while scrolling through listings, she came across an ad that seemed almost too good to be true. Roommate wanted, females only. Private room, bath, $3,000 month. The photo attached showed a quaint brick townhouse, partially obscured by overgrown ivy. It looked a little neglected, but the price was irresistible. Sophie emailed the poster immediately and received a reply within 20 minutes. The roommate, a woman named Lila, explained she worked late shifts as a nurse and invited Sophie to visit the next evening at 8 p.m. When Sophie arrived, twilight had painted the sky in shades of deep purple. The neighborhood was eerily quiet, and the house was darker than she expected. A handwritten note on the front door read, "Front door broken. Please use the back." The yard was overgrown, with weeds tangling around the cracked path. Despite the oddity, Sophie pressed on. The back door creaked open, revealing a man in his 40s. His face was gaunt, shadowed by uneven stubble, and his sunken eyes darted nervously. "You must be Sophie," he said with a too-wide grin. "I'm Lila's uncle. She's stuck at work, so she asked me to show you around." Something about him set her teeth on edge. "Oh," Sophie stammered, glancing at the dimly lit kitchen behind him. "I wasn't expecting." "Don't worry," he interrupted, stepping aside. "Come in. You'll love the place." Reluctantly, Sophie crossed the threshold. The kitchen smelled faintly of mildew, and only one overhead bulb flickered weakly. As he led her through the house, she noticed the barren rooms, each one devoid of furniture. The silence was oppressive, broken only by their footsteps echoing on the wooden floors. "Lila's room is off limits," the man said abruptly, gesturing at a closed door. "She's very private." Sophie nodded, her unease growing. The living room's front door was boarded up with a thick wooden plank, crudely nailed into place. The man's explanations felt rehearsed, and his gaze lingered on her uncomfortably long. "And this," he said, stopping before a door in the hallway, "leads to the basement. It's a great space, newly renovated. You should check it out." He opened the door outward, creating a narrow barrier between Sophie and the back exit. The stairs descended into darkness. He flipped a switch, but no light came on. "Must be the bulb," he muttered, motioning toward the void. "Ladies first." Sophie froze. Her pulse hammered in her ears as a wave of dread washed over her. The man's posture seemed coiled, his grin fading into something harder to read. Just then, her phone buzzed loudly in her pocket. "Oh!" she exclaimed, pulling it out and pretending to answer. "Hey, you're outside? I'll come get you." She forced a smile. "My friend's here to check out the place too. I'll go grab her." Before he could react, she slipped past him and hurried out the back door. Once outside, Sophie sprinted to her car, her hands trembling as she fumbled with the keys. She didn't look back until she was safely inside, locking the doors and driving off. Later that night, Sophie called the police. Their investigation revealed the house had been abandoned for months, its utilities shut off. In the room the man had claimed was Lila's, they found piles of soiled blankets and a makeshift mattress surrounded by empty food containers. More chillingly, the basement was rigged with a thin wire stretched shin-high across the steps, likely to trip anyone descending. The cold concrete floor held only a pile of blankets, a metal rod wrapped in duct tape, and a small wooden box containing zip ties and rolls of electrical tape. Sophie didn't sleep for days after. The police never found the man. To this day, she can't shake the memory of his crooked smile and the oppressive darkness of that basement. Story 2. The White Van. Elliot was just 15, a kid who loved hockey but had to scrape together every cent to afford equipment. One night, while browsing an online marketplace, he found an ad that seemed like a dream. A full set of goalie gear pads, gloves, stick for only $60. The photos showed barely used items, far better than anything he could afford at a sporting goods store. He immediately messaged the seller. The reply came quickly. The seller, a man named Joe, seemed friendly, asking about Elliot's love for the game and his position on the team. Joe even called him dedicated for such a young age. It felt harmless at the time. When Elliot asked for the seller's address, Joe suggested they meet somewhere neutral. "Parking lot by the park," Joe texted. "Easy for both of us." The next day, just before sunset, Elliot walked to the park. It was close to his neighborhood, so his parents didn't question it. When he arrived, the lot was nearly empty except for a few scattered cars. He waited under a flickering streetlight, glancing at his phone. A few minutes later, he heard a faint honk and saw an old white van parked at the far end of the lot. "Here," Joe texted. "Come to the van. Easier this way." Elliot hesitated. Something about the van felt wrong, the peeling paint, the way it was parked away from everything else. "Can you bring the gear out here?" he texted back. A few seconds later, the passenger door cracked open. A man stepped out, waving but not coming closer. He was in his late 40s, wearing a stained baseball cap pulled low over his face. "Come on," the man called. "It's all in the back. Won't take a second." Elliot's gut tightened. "No thanks," he shouted, stepping backward. The man's friendly demeanor shifted. "Don't waste my time, kid. You want it or not." Panic bubbled in Elliot's chest. "I'll think about it," he stammered, turning toward the sidewalk. As he walked away, the van's engine roared to life. Glancing back, Elliot saw the van creeping out of the lot. His stomach dropped when he realized it was following him. A second man was now visible in the passenger seat, his face obscured by shadows. Elliot's legs carried him faster than his thoughts. He bolted down the street, heart pounding. He turned sharply into an alley and cut through a narrow path leading to a residential block. Ducking behind a hedge, he crouched, his breath shallow. Moments later, the van rolled slowly down the street. The headlights swept across the houses before disappearing around the corner. Elliot waited until he was sure they were gone before making a break for home. That night, Elliot's nerves were frayed. He told his parents everything. They were furious, demanding to know why he hadn't told them about the meeting. His dad called the police, but without a license plate or detailed description of the men, there wasn't much to report. Elliot hoped it was over, but just past midnight, a low rumble woke him. Peeking out his window, he saw the white van idling across the street. The engine hummed softly in the quiet neighborhood. Elliot froze, unsure if they knew which house was his. When he moved the curtain slightly, the van's headlights turned on, and it sped off into the night. The van never returned, but Elliot's sense of security never fully came back either. Even years later, when he passed by a parked white van, a familiar chill crept up his spine. The thought of what could have happened still haunted him, a stark reminder that some deals aren't worth the risk. Story 3. The Dining Set. Claire had been trying to sell her dining set for weeks. It was a beautiful, hand-carved oak table with matching chairs, but living in the countryside meant finding buyers wasn't easy. She listed it online for $1,200, slightly negotiable. One evening, just as she was about to give up hope, her phone buzzed. A man named Martin had seen her ad and wanted to take a look. His voice was shaky, almost trembling, but he seemed genuinely interested. "I could come by tonight," he offered. Claire hesitated, but figured it was worth a shot. She gave him her address, and he said he'd be there in an hour. Not even 10 minutes later, the doorbell rang. Claire froze. No one could possibly arrive that quickly unless they lived nearby and in her remote town. That was rare. She opened the door cautiously. The man standing there didn't match what she had imagined. His shirt was stained with yellow blotches, his pants were torn, and his hair looked like it hadn't been washed in weeks. A thick gray mustache drooped over his lips, stained in the middle, as if he smoked heavily. His eyes, though, were what unnerved her the most. They were small, darting, and restless. "Claire?" he asked, his voice as shaky as it had been on the phone. Without waiting for her invitation, he stepped inside, his gaze locking onto the dining room. Claire followed him hesitantly. "This is it," she said, gesturing toward the set. Martin moved slowly, almost reverently, running his hands over the polished wood. He muttered to himself, his fingers tracing every groove and curve of the table. The room fell eerily silent except for his muttering, punctuated by occasional strange noises humming, clicking his tongue. Claire forced a smile. So, the price is $1,200, but I'm willing to negotiate a little. Martin stopped and turned to face her, his lips curled into a grin so wide it seemed unnatural. How about 1,500? She laughed nervously. I'm sorry, that's too low. The lowest I can go is 1,000. The grin vanished, replaced by a scowl. Martin's demeanor shifted, his body tensed, and he began pacing back and forth, muttering again, his voice louder this time. His hands moved to his head, clutching at his greasy hair. Claire's heart raced. I'm really sorry, she said, her voice trembling. But I don't think this is going to work out. Maybe we should. Before she could finish, Martin stopped pacing and glared at her. His eyes burned with something dark, something unhinged. I think I'll stay, he said, his tone low and menacing. Claire's blood ran cold. She forced a polite smile and stepped back. I appreciate you coming out, but it's late, and Martin reached into his back pocket. Claire didn't wait to see what he was pulling out. She turned and bolted up the stairs, slamming her bedroom door shut. Her hands shook as she locked it and grabbed the phone to call the police. In her closet, she found her father's old pistol, loaded it with trembling fingers, and crouched behind the bed, heart pounding. She strained to hear any sound from downstairs, but was met with silence. When the police finally arrived, their flashing lights illuminated the driveway. Claire heard them calling out from the front door, but she stayed frozen in place. She only emerged when one of the officers shouted up to her that it was safe. They led her outside, where she saw Martin being escorted out in handcuffs. One of the officers looked at her grimly. He was hiding in your pantry, he said. Claire's knees nearly buckled. She clutched the officer's arm as he continued. He had a loaded handgun in his pocket. We're lucky he didn't use it. As Martin was led to the patrol car, he turned and locked eyes with her through the window. His face was a mask of pure malice, his lips twisting into a sinister smile that sent shivers down her spine. That night, Claire sat awake in her now empty dining room, every creak of the house setting her nerves on edge. She couldn't shake the thought of Martin, his angry eyes, and the terrifying reality that he had planned to harm her. Days later, Claire sold the dining set to someone else, but the experience lingered like a shadow. Even now, years later, every unexpected knock at the door brings her back to that night, to the uninvited guest who refused to leave.